Redeeming the Shadow of the Self, a depth psychological, cross-cultural investigation of the foreshadow archetype. A dissertation submitted by Dylan Craig Odner to Pacifica Graduate Institute in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Mythological Studies with emphasis in depth psychology. This dissertation has been accepted for the faculty of Pacifica Graduate Institute by Dr. Patrick Mahaffey, Chair Dr. Dana White, Reader Dr. Lydia Reineck, External Reader. ProQuest. Copyright Dylan Craig Odner, 2019. Abstract. Redeeming the Shadow of the Self, a depth psychological, cross-cultural investigation of the foreshadow archetype by Dylan Craig Odner. More than any of his other archetypal forms, C.G. Jung's conception of the shadow has found a permanent place within popular culture. But whether it manifests bodily as a shadow figure or permeates the conscious world in the form of a shadow realm, the Jungian shadow is presumed to be a negative and even sinister archetypal force. In fact, it is precisely these negative qualities that are now used to identify shadow figures within myths, folk tales, works of literature, and other narratives. This dissertation sheds light on an overlooked archetypal presence which I call the foreshadow. The foreshadow archetype represents the theoretical ideal of what the shadow can be. Still dark, wild, and hairy, but not sinister or frightening. Through a depth psychological and cross-cultural study of figures who embody this foreshadow archetype, including John the Baptist, Merlin, Al-Qadir, Hanuman, Siddhartha, and others, this dissertation lays out a constellation of symbols and narrative elements particular to the foreshadow, much as Jung did in Ion researches into the phenomenology of the self. Embraced by its ego figure, the foreshadow is what the shadow always wishes to be, not the lurking enemy of the undeveloped ego, but rather the devoted servant of the transcendent ego, helping it along the path to individuation that leads ultimately to an era-defining symbol of the self. Acknowledgements. The earliest inkling of what would eventually evolve into my notion of the foreshadow archetype came to me in the fall of 2014. Still in my first term at Pacifica, I was sitting in MS 503 Hindu Traditions, enjoying a lecture from my professor, later my dissertation chair, Dr. Patrick Mahaffey. Dr. Mahaffey was referencing a peripheral folktale about a Hindu monkey god named Hanuman, who shrank himself down in size and crawled through a crack in the earth in search of his master's ring. The monkey descended all the way to the underworld and fell from its ceiling onto a silver platter. In some unconscious line of thinking that I hardly understand better now than I did at the time, I thought, monkey, platter, John the Baptist. I fear that I momentarily derailed my professor's train of thought with my hasty request for a citation for the story. My term paper ended up being a comparative study which connected Hanuman the monkey to John the Baptist from the Christian New Testament. Those who continue through this dissertation will note that Chapter 6 is rife with connections between these two disparate figures, and yet the particular folk tale above does not appear. It is not that the association found therein are invalid, but rather that they prove quite unconvincing when compared to the myriad other connections that I have found in the years since. This first archetypal connection between Hanuman and John the Baptist served as a Rosetta Stone moment that gave way to a still growing constellation of foreshadow figures that span centuries and continents. This dissertation would not be possible without the institutional support, the personal reassurance, the schedule flexibility, and the financial backing of the Academy of the New Church. I am also indebted to the Carpenter Fellowship Fund for its continued support. Finally, I would like to thank Pacifica Graduate Institute for becoming an intellectual and emotional oasis for me, the members of my dissertation committee for their ever-present guidance, and my family and friends for their energetic encouragement and vicarious excitement for my journey, without which I certainly would have sputtered to a stop years ago. This work is dedicated to the memory of my grandmother, Aubrey Cole Oedner. Mythos, or mythological truth, is often a wily protean creature that must be sought out and meticulously tracked, but it is not always so passive. I had no particular passion for mythology until my grandmother's passing in 2011, when her lifelong love for folk and fairy tale, world mythology, and Arthurian legend was passed to me, as if overnight. It is a testament both to her legacy and to the mercurial power of myth that our connection is stronger today than it was when she still lived in this physical world. Chapter 1. Introduction. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. William Butler Yeats, The Second Coming. There is a man who lives in the wilderness outside of town. Some say he is a magician, some call him a priest of nature, and others insist that he is an all-seeing prophet, but his powers are ancient and mysterious. His hermetic existence is evident in his wild appearance. It is difficult to distinguish his unkempt body hair from the skins and furs he wears as garments. At times he seems to confuse the future with the past, effect with cause, and so his enigmatic words hover between wisdom and madness. Even still, his life's mission stretches clearly before him at every moment. Someone or something is coming, though he knows not precisely where or when, and everything will change. A new era is beginning, though the world will not recognize it. But from his place in the shadows, this wild man anticipates the birth of a new light. Who is this shadow harbinger? Depending on one's cultural background, answers vary. Some may imagine John the Baptist, clothed in camel's hair, crying out from the wilderness of Judea, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Others might picture the long-bearded Merlin, last of the Druid nature priests, prophetically engineering the rise of King Arthur, and more importantly, establishing the quest for the Holy Grail, Europe's guiding light out of a dark age. Readers from an Eastern tradition may remember the Hindu god Hanuman, who was born on Earth as a hairy monkey to await Vishnu's next avatar, Rama. Still others might see Siddhartha during his phase of extreme asceticism, months and years of self-renunciation in the woods of India, paving way for the birth of his own enlightened self, the Buddha. As a comparativist and as an archetypalist, I contend that these disparate characters fulfill a single archetypal role, although this claim is not without controversy. The comparative method is often critiqued for an ill-defined brand of universalist language. Wendy Doniger speaks directly to critics of the comparative method in The Implied Spider, Politics and Theology in Myth. What do we mean by saying that a story is the same as, or even similar to, another story, while acknowledging that the context is different? We often feel that the various tellings of a much retold myth are the same, at least in the sense that they do not disappoint us by omitting what we regard as essential parts of the myth, without which it would lose at very least some of its charm, and at the most its meaning. When we say that two myths from two different cultures are the same, we mean that there are certain plots that come up again and again, revealing a set of human concerns that transcend any cultural barriers, experiences that we might call cross-cultural or transcultural. But if, as I contend, these varying figures are all embodiments of a single archetype, what is the nature of this unexplored presence, and how does it fit within the larger scheme of Jungian archetypal psychology? When C.G. Jung published Ion, Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, all of the major pieces for his model of the human psyche were firmly established. Sigmund Freud's placement of the ego as the center of consciousness can be seen as both a starting point and a splitting off point for Jung's model, for it led to keystone Jungian concepts, most notably the archetypes and the collective unconscious from which they emerge. For Jung, there was no set number of these archetypes, and yet some were more central to his system and will be explicated along with other Jungian terms in Chapter 2. The anima slash animus, the ego slash persona, the shadow, and his crown jewel, the self. Jung describes this final archetype, the self, as an embodiment of total wholeness and balance. It is the yin and yang of the Tao, the union of opposites, and for all intents and purposes, the symbol of God. Footnote. Though the collected works of C.G. Jung do not, I have chosen to capitalize Jung's archetype of the self in accordance with many thinkers, including Edinger, Neumann, von Franz, and others. I do this for aesthetic as well as conceptual reasons. Aesthetically, capitalization helps to distinguish the archetypal and almost sacred self from the individual and profane self. Capitalization, bop, bop. Aesthetically, capitalization helps to distinguish the archetypal and almost sacred self from the individual and profane self. Conceptually, capitalization also helps to distinguish and elevate Jung's self above the individual ego. Edward Edinger helped to further structure Jung's model of the psyche in ego and archetype, individuation, and the religious function of the psyche. Edinger articulates the concept of the self by casting it as the upper extreme on a spectrum, which he calls the ego-self axis. Placement of an individual ego along this axis is by no means static, and the process of individuation in analytical psychology might be described as an ascension of the ego toward the divine totality that is the self. This indicates that the self is not an altogether separate archetype from the ego. Instead, the self is the transcendent or ideal ego, typified in transformative symbols such as the Holy Grail and embodied by era-defining figures like Christ and the Buddha. It is conceivable that all archetypes exist on such a spectrum, with a unique symbol set and phenomenology identifiable at each extreme. The archetypal father is equally present in the beloved Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird and in the abusive Pap from Huckleberry Finn. The joy and the tragedy of the puer aeternus, or eternal child, are both expressed in the pop star Michael Jackson and in his pathological identification. To Peter Pan, the Wicked Witch of the West and Glinda the Good Witch occupy two extremes on a single archetypal spectrum. In Shadow and Evil and Fairy Tales, Marie-Louise von Franz applies this concept of a spectrum to the anima archetype with great effect. Quote, there is Venus Orania, the heavenly Venus, or Venus Pandemos, the profane Venus, the divine and the vulgar. The symbol of one is the dove, and of the other the sparrow. The anima contains this duality and is within herself neither an idea nor something physical, but in her own essence something between the opposites. Jung was well aware of the dualistic nature of the archetypal energy. He had a unique ability to see the shadow side of life, and some would go as far as to say that this is the core of his psychology. But in my view, he overlooked the totality of just one archetype, ironically, the shadow itself. Jung defines the shadow as, quote, the negative side of the personality, the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide altogether with the insufficiently developed functions and the contents of the personal unconscious. At first it appears that Jung does indeed place the shadow on a spectrum, for he describes gradients. Quote, Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Like the infamous Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll's deep, dark secret, the shadow becomes blacker and more sinister the longer it is repressed. But Jung never fully addresses the question that naturally follows. What becomes of the shadow if it is not repressed, but is instead immediately embraced by the ego? The rare ego capable of such transcendent self-knowledge is precisely what is meant by the self, or the ideal ego, for, quote, shadow integration is essentially synonymous with self-knowledge, end quote. How does the shadow behave on this ideal side of the archetypal spectrum? It is possible to imagine that, like Hans Christian Andersen's The Shadow, it becomes ever more anemic and impotent as the ego ascends the ego-self axis until the shadow is simply overwhelmed by the light of the sun-like self. But for me, this conclusion would fly in the face of the balance and sophistication characteristic of Jungian and post-Jungian psychology. The shadow is not some conceptual creation of the ego, but an empowered presence from the realm of the unconscious. What Alexander Burke says of John the Baptist is also true, I believe, of the shadow as a whole. That the shadow is not a problem to be solved, but rather a mystery to be plumbed and appreciated. The goal of this dissertation is to establish a clear phenomenology for what I call the foreshadow archetype. This archetype is the zenith of a shadow-foreshadow axis, which I place alongside Edinger's ego-self axis. Through a cross-cultural study of figures who embody the foreshadow archetype, including John the Baptist, Merlin, Al-Qadir, Hahnemann, Siddhartha, and others, I lay out a constellation of symbols and narrative elements particular to the foreshadow archetype that is as consistent and universal as that which Jung outlined to identify the archetype of the self. In fact, the foreshadow and the self are inexorably linked. As the ego recognizes and embraces its own shadow energy, the tension and fear that define the typical ego-shadow relationship is transcended, giving way to a mutual bond between conscious and unconscious elements within the mandala of the self. Review of the literature. Depth psychology, religious studies, and mythological studies. At its core, this project is rooted in depth psychology. I therefore lean heavily on the collected works of C.G. Jung. In particular, Volume 9, Part 1, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, and Volume 9, Part 2, Ion Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self, serve as the best summation of Jung's overall model of the psyche and description of core archetypal forms. As is the case with so many great ventures, it is impossible to truly understand Jungian psychology without understanding its enigmatic founder, who describes himself as, quote, a somewhat complicated phenomenon, end quote. Jung's famous memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, is a helpful window into the man's unique mind and perplexing history. I qualify and enrich Jung's own telling of his story with Deidre Baer's Jung, a biography, and Barbara Hanna's Jung, His Life and Work, a biographical memoir, both of which touch on the infamous Jung-Freud relationship that so deeply shaped and then damaged the two men. But this well-documented friendship gone awry is dealt with in more detail in Lingering Shadows, Jungian Freudians, and Anti-Semitism by R.A. Medenbaum and Stephen Martin, which explores the darker claims levied against Jung throughout his long career. The works of a number of contemporaries of Jung and early adopters of his psychology, including Yolande Jacobi, Edward Edinger, Erich Neumann, and Joseph Henderson, were vital to me in clarifying Jung's more difficult concepts. As her title suggests, Jacobi's complex archetype symbol introduces and defines Jungian terms in a logical and clear progression. Edinger also serves to explicate Jung, and with his aforementioned addition of the ego-self axis in Ego and Archetype, further develops Jung's ideas in powerful ways. In Depth Psychology and a New Ethic, Neumann meaningfully explores the larger implication of Jung's psychology for society as a whole. He also appends the work with an essay titled Reflection on the Shadow, which greatly clarifies the archetype of the shadow and argues for its central importance within Jungian psychology. Henderson's Shadow and Self Selected Papers in Analytical Psychology is an extensive collection of the author's essays dealing with the titular archetype and, more importantly, how the two interact. James Hillman's iconoclastic approach in revisioning psychology goes far beyond traditional Jungian thought. Hillman therefore represents the beginning of a truly post-Jungian movement characterized by an even more mature relationship with the psyche, the unconscious, and the shadow. As he says in his introduction, this book is about soul making, an effort I emulate in this project. Susan Rowland's Remembering Dionysus, Revisioning Psychology and Literature in C.G. Jung and James Hillman offers an up-to-date overview of Jung and Hillman and the complicated relationship between their particular approaches. Rowland also has a talent for fully but succinctly describing difficult concepts, and so her book was invaluable to me as a veritable glossary of psychological terms and ideas. Von Franz made a career by masterfully applying Jung's psychology to her interpretation of fairy tales, but this dissertation finds particular relevance in shadow and evil in fairy tales. I look to Jeanette Paris less for her specific content and more as a stylistic model to emulate. In Pagan Grace, Dionysus, Hermes, and Goddess Memory in Daily Life, Paris demonstrates how archetypal character studies can remain relevant and compelling in a modern voice. Even 70 years after its original publishing, Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces comes across as a modern voice as well. With his personal charisma and his uncanny ability to cast himself and his readers into the life of the classic hero, Campbell put the field of mythology back into popular consciousness and became its first bona fide celebrity. But his greatest contribution was to shed light on the hero as a Jungian archetype and inexorably connect the hero to the ego, the so-called ego hero. Richard Caro, in his 2014 dissertation titled The Heroic Shadow, Development of the Ego-Shadow Complex, is yet one more example of a contemporary archetypal study and one with particular relevance. Caro adds nuance to our understanding of the shadow archetype by emphasizing its deep connection to the ego. The shadow is the ego where the ego is unconscious. For many, the act of comparison seems to be second nature, and perhaps even common sense. Even so, the particular set of intellectual tools needed in order to apply this as an academic method comes in part from the influence of the structuralists, beginning with Claude Lévi-Strauss. In The Story of Acidois, Lévi-Strauss offers a clear example of how to symbolically dissect a narrative based upon what he calls binary oppositions, up and down, inside and outside, female and male, leading to valuable insights. Lévi-Strauss and the structuralists are predated by and indebted to Arnold van Gennep for his take on liminality, as expounded in his groundbreaking work, The Rites of Passage. Van Gennep uses the term primarily to describe betwixt and between stages that tend to occur during key religious rituals. But it wasn't until Victor Turner borrowed the concept in Ritual Process, Structure and Anti-Structure, that the term left the microcosmic world of a single ritual and was first used to describe the betwixt and between elements of society as a whole. The term applies to the study at hand in that the foreshadow archetype is decidedly liminal. To navigate a cross-cultural depth psychological study of both religious and secular material, I look to three primary guides: Wendy Doniger, Robert Elwood, and William Patton. In Implied Spider, Politics and Theology and Myth, Doniger helps to redeem the comparative method, so often seen as overly romantic and even ethnocentric, and faces head-on the charges levied against it. Where Doniger redeems the method, Elwood redeems the champions of that method in The Politics of Myth, a study of C.G. Jung, Mircea Eliade, and Joseph Campbell. Patton also proves worthy of emulation by presenting a culturally sensitive yet intellectually critical model for studying cross-cultural narratives in interpreting the sacred. Character studies. After the theoretical overview of Jungian psychology in Chapter 2, the remainder of this dissertation takes the form of a series of in-depth character studies. At the outset, it is important to note that the subject of these character studies, John the Baptist, Merlin, Al-Qadir, Hanuman, Siddhartha, I primarily approached as archetypal figures. I do not outright ignore their relative historicity, and I respect their varying levels of theological significance. And yet, this will not be the focus of the project. In this sense, my approach will have much in common with a traditional literary analysis, but for one significant difference: neither official canon nor even authorial intent will hold definitive sway. Said another way, even relatively recent literary characters such as Faust and Mephistopheles will not be viewed wholly as fictional creations by Goethe, but rather as successful embodiments of archetypal essence whose long popularity indicates deep resonance within the collective unconscious. The figure of John the Baptist, for instance, is explored in both canonical and non-canonical sources. For consistency, How Tussig's A New Testament, a Bible for the 21st century combining traditional and newly discovered texts, offers up-to-date translations and valuable commentary. This primary source serves as the foundation upon which I overlay two contrasting takes on the Baptist. In The Friend of the Bridegroom, on Orthodox veneration of the Forerunner, Sergei Bulgakov unapologetically takes on the insider voice of a believer. As a theologian in the Russian Orthodox Church, some of his reverent vocabulary is at odds with the more academic tone displayed in John the Baptist, Prophet and Disciple by Alexander Burke. But the two hagiographies are highly complementary at their core. The Jewish Study Bible, edited by Adelaide Berlin and Mark Z, serves as an initial review of a number of Old Testament figures featured throughout the study, most prominently in chapters 2 and 3. Additionally, I look to Louis Ginsberg's Legends of the Bible as my access to the extensive tradition of peripheral Jewish folk narratives. The character study of Merlin the Magician likewise leans heavily on a collection of primary source materials. In The Romance of Arthur, an anthology of medieval texts in translation, editors Norris Lacey and James Wilhelm organize and introduce works stretching back well over 1,000 years. Merlin himself is not featured heavily, but the collection helps to ground the character within the larger tradition. In addition to his work as a Celtic historian, Jean Markel also is a poet, and his artistic voice is not lost in Merlin, priest of nature. His talent for keeping the archetype alive within the work is a valuable model for any depth psychological study. John Matthews' Merlin, shaman, prophet, magician, also digs deep into the true nature of this complex character. Most notably, Matthews' book extends further into modern tellings and popular culture references, thereby adding to the larger picture. Edward Arlington Robinson's Merlin, a poem, as well as Mary Stuart's The Merlin Trilogy, The Crystal Cave, The Hollow Hills, The Last Enchantment, both stand out as works which intuitively understand Merlin and therefore the shadow archetype. Written respectively in the 1910s and the 1970s, these works are late additions to Arthurian mythos. But because of the author's unconventional use of what we might call a shadow protagonist, and even more for their seemingly instinctual understanding of depth psychology, both authors offer invaluable insights. The earliest written source for Hanuman, the Hindu monkey god, is the Ramayana, or Ramayana, dated with general consensus circa 2nd century BCE. As a starting point, I reference William Buck's famous English translation retelling, but more direct translations are also incorporated where needed. As with previous character studies, this primary source is supplemented with in-depth surveys of the character, including Hahnemann's tale, The Messages of a Divine Monkey by Philip Lutendorf, and Hahnemann, The Devotion and Power of the Monkey God by Vanamali. Both character biographies cover not only Hahnemann's role within the Ramayana, but also the folklore surrounding this wildly popular deity. Ludgendorff even connects Hahnemann to the main character of a 16th century Chinese epic novel, so David Kerrigan's Monkey, A Journey into the West, serves as a segue from Hinduism to Buddhism by accompanying the hairy protagonist on his Buddhist pilgrimage to India. The next character study focuses on the life of Siddhartha and on his eventual awakening as the Buddha. This is also the focus of Thich Nhat Hanh's tome, Old Path, White Cloud, Walking in the Footsteps of the Buddha. Nhat Hanh manages to convey even more complex Buddhist philosophies to his largely Western audience while keeping a beautiful simplicity in his words. Anyone attempting to tackle a project so large must make choices of what will be highlighted and what will be downplayed. For this reason, it is particularly important to contrast Nhat Hanh's work with others. Bhikkhu Namalali in The Life of the Buddha, according to the Pali Canon, adds this contrast, creating a fuller picture of the millennia-long tradition surrounding Siddhartha and the Buddha. This study contends that the two distinct phases of his life, instances of what I will call the Siddhartha phase and the Buddha phase, can essentially be viewed as separate archetypes. The title character in Siddhartha therefore offers a unique opportunity for comparison, because author Hermann Hesse chooses to entirely separate Siddhartha from the figure of Gautama Buddha. Because he was a Westerner himself, Henry Corbin's career and works in Islamic studies proved invaluable to me as a cross-cultural window into the Middle East. This window is especially vital when Westerners like myself try to grasp a mysterious figure like Al-Qadir, the verdant one or green man of Islam. Al-Qadir is not actually the central focus of Alone with the Alone. But even still, Corbin's masterful voice serves as a helpful, if cursory, introduction to the Green Man. Where Corbin's book drops the subject, Hugh Talat Hallman fills in the gaps with his tome on Al-Qadir titled Where the Two Seas Meet. Organization of Study. Dissertation overview. This study explores the phenomenology of the foreshadow archetype with two primary approaches, the depth psychological and the comparative. Chapter 2 offers a cursory introduction to Jungian thought and therefore leans heavily on the concepts, vocabulary, and foundational thinkers from the field of depth psychology. A brief survey of familiar and well-studied shadow figures from timeless works of literature serves as an entryway into what might be called shadow psychology. Chapter 3 exposes an underdeveloped recess of the Jungian model of the psyche and then introduces the foreshadow archetype into this niche. Chapters 4 through 6 build on the depth psychological concepts from chapters 2 and 3 while focusing on a series of cross-cultural examples of the foreshadow, each of which serves to highlight a unique aspect of this multifaceted archetype. Chapter 7 concludes the project by combining the character studies from the previous chapters into a single comparative analysis. Recurring symbols and narrative themes are viewed from the depth psychological perspective and distilled into a coherent phenomenology for the foreshadow archetype. This is the broadest This is, in the broadest of terms, the form that this dissertation takes. What follows then is a more in-depth analysis of the goals and specific content of each individual chapter. Chapter 2, C.G. Jung and the Shadow. Chapter 2 introduces the Jungian model of the psyche, focusing most heavily on Jung's own description of central archetypal structures, including the ego persona, the self, and most importantly, the shadow. As previously mentioned, one cannot hope to understand Jungian psychology without understanding Jung himself, and so Chapter 2 is somewhat biographical. Jung often said that, quote, the brighter the light, the blacker the shadow. And this sentiment proved prophetic for his own polarizing imprint on the world. Works of fiction which deal heavily with the shadow have a way of blurring the line between literature and psychology, and necessarily also deal with the archetype of the ego and the self. The sheer volume of these sources seems to demarcate shadow psychology as a subgenre in its own right. As Neumann convincingly argues, the shadow is a central concern of modern psychology as such. Long explored literary shadow figures, Goethe's Mephistopheles, Stevenson's Mr. Hyde, and Hesse's Steppenwolf, therefore provide ample material for a comparative analysis that demonstrates the particular set of symbols, motifs, and larger themes which naturally manifest surrounding the shadow archetype. But perhaps more importantly, this comparative study serves as a meta-analysis of the Jungian approach itself, the freewheeling and almost mystical way in which all possible sources, from works of fiction to personal dream and even semi-historical events, are seen as fair game for psychological interpretation, can be baffling to the uninitiated. This chapter therefore seeks to bring these depth psychological presumptions out in the open. Chapter 3, Introducing the Foreshadow Archetype and the Shadow-Foreshadow Axis. Chapter 3 progresses further into post-Jungian territory to explore how later thinkers applied and evolved Jung's ideas. Prominent among these thinkers is Edward Edinger, because of his vital addition of the ego-self axis, along which I theorize a shadow-foreshadow axis. The chapter illustrates these dual axes by means of a comparative biblical character study. The combative relationship of Jacob and Esau is set in contrast to the cooperative bond between Jesus and John the Baptist, representing respectively the typical ego-shadow dynamic and the ideal self-foreshadow dynamic. In addition to highlighting an existing niche for the foreshadow within the Jungian model of the psyche, Chapter 3 introduces John the Baptist as the first practical example of how this archetypal figure presents itself within a narrative and distinguishes itself from more traditional shadow figures, thereby validating the addition of the new term proposed in this dissertation. Chapter 4, Object Symbols of the Self, Old Testament Prophets as Foreshadow. Chapter 4 serves to broaden and deliteralize the archetypal foreshadow. Remaining within the biblical paradigm, The study analyzes a series of Old Testament figures whose respective roles as foreshadow paved the way not for a human embodiment of the self, as John does for Jesus, but rather for an object symbol of the self. These foreshadow figures, Moses, Samson, Samuel, and Elijah, seem to naturally emerge from the liminal boundaries between distinct phases of Israel's long mytho-religious history in order to prepare the people for the next evolution of their God image. Chapter 5. Secular Symbols of the Self. Merlin, Foreshadow of the Grail. The foreshadow's central role is to prepare humanity for the manifestation of the self. But the self is not always religious in nature. Chapter 5 views Merlin the magician as a prime example of the foreshadow archetype in a secular setting. Christianity, and more specifically the early Catholic Church, was the last remaining semblance of order in the chaos of the Dark Ages of Western Europe, and yet the mysterious figure of Merlin is a pagan nature priest with a powerful shadow presence. Like Samuel, he prepares for the coming of the king, but his mission runs deeper than this. Just below the surface, Merlin's true motivation can be seen in all of his actions. He is the forerunner of the Grail, a symbol of the self every bit as potent as the lost Ark of the Covenant. The quest for the Grail offers feudal Europe a higher principle to strive for, pulling the collective gaze away from the shadow of fallen Rome and forward to a new worldview. Chapter 6. The Outward Journey and the Inward Journey. Chapter 6 brings the focus further east to the ancient traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism. From a Western perspective, these two religions seem to have much in common, but their central distinctions are of more relevance at present. Like the narratives of ancient Egypt or ancient Greece, the tradition of Hinduism is decidedly mythical. The colorful pantheon of gods, the fantastical array of beasts and demons, and the superhuman feats performed by characters are, in the depth psychological perspective, interpreted as metaphor. As such, this chapter views Hanuman, the immortal shape-shifting monkey god and ultimate devotee of Rama, as a product of the collective unconscious. Hanuman's wild appearance and extraordinary abilities are vibrant mythological images of psychological qualities that define the foreshadow archetype. If Hinduism is a mythological religion, Buddhism is a psychological one. So much so that some Buddhist teachings and practices are virtually interchangeable with those of modern psychology. By ending with the inward journey of Siddhartha, we return once again to the depth psychological lens that was developed in chapters 2 and 3. From a Jungian perspective, John the Baptist, Merlin, and especially Hanuman are embodiments of a single archetype, split off from the ego consciousness of their respective narratives. But the Buddha and Siddhartha, his foreshadow, are not bodily separated. Like Faust in all but attitude, quote, two souls, alas, are dwelling in one breast. Chapter 6 therefore concludes by exploring the ways in which Siddhartha's phase of extreme asceticism in the wilderness foreshadows the birth of the Buddha within himself. Chapter 7, Conclusion. Al-Qadir, the lineage and liminality of the foreshadow. In Alone with the Alone, foundational Islamist Henry Corbin describes one of the most mysterious religio-mythic characters of any culture. Al-Qadir, often deemed the Green Man of Islam, is an enigma who appears at key moments throughout the complex Islamic tradition. But instead of playing a narrative role, as the foreshadow, Al-Qadir seems to manifest with the singular goal to meet in secret with an emerging religious figure. He serves as a de facto mentor, bestowing upon his disciple a mystical form of gnosis that is particular to the foreshadow archetype. Two prominent figures who receive this mystical gift, the so-called disciples of Qadir, are none other than Moses and Elijah, aforementioned examples of the foreshadow archetype. Al-Qadir therefore serves as a final character study in this dissertation because he is not only an example of the foreshadow archetype, but is also the closest thing to what Jungians call the archetype per se, that protean source within the collective unconscious from which the archetypal image draws its essence. Corbin himself notes this unique role. Phenomenologically speaking, the real presence of Kadir is experienced simultaneously as that of a person and as that of an archetype, in other words, as a person archetype. Chapter 7 concludes the dissertation by combining the foreshadow examples outlined in chapters 3 through 7 into a single comparative study, using Al-Qadir as its focal point. Recurring symbols such as the foreshadow's association with hair and nature, and narrative themes such as the mysterious birth and death of the foreshadow, are analyzed through the lens of depth psychology, leading ultimately to a phenomenological understanding of this unexplored archetype. The foreshadow lives in the wilderness outside of town. Though he is a priest, prophet, a sorcerer, a herald, and more, he is seen only as a madman in his own time. But what is his own time? The foreshadow, quote, belongs to those who have been caught between two ages, whose fate it is to live the whole riddle of human destiny. Like Al-Qadir, he exists in a transcendent, transhistorical dimension. He dresses like a madman because civil pleasantries are irrelevant when the kingdom of heaven is at hand. The foreshadow lives as a hermit because, like Siddhartha, personal comfort is no great price to pay for self-knowledge. In short, the foreshadow is anachronistic and mysterious precisely because his mission transcends time and culture. Just as Mercale says of Merlin, the foreshadow, quote, separates himself from the society of his time and affirms his discovery of a new reality, a new alliance. From this it is evident that Merlin, who is taken for a madman, is in fact a sage, end quote. It is impossible to predict when another era-defining symbol of the self, the likes of Rama, Jesus, the Buddha, the Ark of the Covenant, or the Holy Grail will appear, and yet it is foreseen by the foreshadow, that, quote, rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouching toward Bethlehem to be born. Yeats, 1729. In Steppenwolf, Hess gives voice to the archetypal foreshadow, and adds to Yeats's rough beast as well, saying, I might be a beast astray, with no sense of its environment, yet there was some meaning in my foolish life. Something in me gave an answer and was the receiver of those distant calls from worlds far above. Set off from society, he awaits this call. The foreshadow is the before shadow. His sudden emergence from the wilderness announces the dawn of a new era and foreshadows the imminent arrival of the self.